All right, greetings. Hello, everybody. My name is Zeev Klein, and I am the co-founder of the Social Innovation Summit. And really just my pleasure to kick off our session this afternoon. I'm calling in from New York today, and for those that might be familiar, UN General Assembly Week tends to be a super vibrant week. In years past, we would have heads of states and various presidents and senior executives from all over the world convene. And it's really a historic time in New York to be able to hold these types of conversations where we're often able to see each other, greet each other, and in UN language, do some bilateral and trilateral meetings, tackling some of the most urgent and pressing issues. Obviously, 2020 didn't allow us to have the physical convening, and so we're hosted here virtually on one of the most absolutely important topics that we could think of, which is exploring philanthropy's role in a democratic society. If we look at the upcoming election and all the different news, we think that there's just a vital dialogue that needs to occur in terms of what can philanthropy do to strengthen our country and strengthen our society. One of the things that we're so pleased to have with us is our partners in today's event at Fidelity Charitable, and alongside them, a number of other esteemed speakers. With that, I'm going to introduce our moderator for today, Pamela Norley. Pamela is the president at Fidelity Charitable. For those who may not be familiar, Fidelity is the nation's leading grant maker. Last year alone, they distributed more than $7.3 billion on behalf of more than 250,000 individuals of all income levels. And I thought it'd be just a great way to tee up our conversation and tee up our discussion by handing the microphone over to Pamela.
Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. American poet and civic leader Archibald MacLeish once said, "Democracy is never a thing done. Democracy is always something that a nation must be doing." So in these unprecedented times during a pandemic and unrest from ongoing racial equity injustices, this quote is an important reminder that the protection of individual rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness require constant focus and the collective efforts of all citizens. A strong democracy is vital to the many challenges and opportunities that are going to be discussed at the 75th convening of the United Nations General Assembly, as Eve mentioned, which kicked off yesterday virtually. Very odd not to be there, but a lot of pre-recorded speeches to mark the occasion. But with this year's UNGA, we're going to listen to global leaders working to develop ideas and solutions in support of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, including goal number 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions, which is especially relevant as we think about today's panel. Often the root cause of the challenges we are facing in the moment is people feeling that they don't have a voice, that they don't have the ability to participate, or even be able to participate or be involved in any way in a democracy. So if you want to effectively address a cause area, then you need to ensure that our democracy is strong and inclusive. And what's important about that is that we have very little philanthropic funding going to support demographic nonprofits at this time, yet nonprofit only makes up less than 1% of the philanthropic funds in the sector. So many of you may know Americans gave away $450 billion in 2019, and only 1% of those dollars went to democratic institutions focused on strengthening our democracy. So it's really important as funders that we address this critically important opportunity where donors can deepen their own impact as strategic philanthropists. So with that in mind, we're here today to help you explore these issues facing our democracy and some of the innovative approaches, both from individual and institutional funders that are working to ensure a healthy, well-functioning society that goes beyond just this upcoming election cycle. So as Eve mentioned, I'm privileged to work at Fidelity Charitable. We've given away over $40 billion, actually, $5 billion through today to nonprofits just year to date, and really proud to continue that work supporting our donors as they return their philanthropic dollars to make it a better world for all of us. So really pleased to welcome today our three panelists. Unbelievably credentialed folks are joining us. We've got Melody Barnes, who's the co-director for policy and public affairs at UVA, and is part of the Democracy Initiative there. Steve Olikara, who's the founder and CEO of the Millennial Action Project. And finally, Joe Goldman, who's the president of the Democracy Fund, and you're going to hear a lot about that today. Their bios are actually below on the screen, but just some of their highlights. Melanie, among other distinguished roles at the University of Virginia, is a professor and co-director for policy and public affairs for the Democracy Initiative at UVA, and was assistant to President Obama and director of the White House Domestic Policy Council. Steve Olikara is a political entrepreneur and founder and CEO of the Millennial Action Project, which is the largest nonpartisan organization of millennial lawmakers in the US, working with over 1,500 elected leaders in Congress. And they're working with Congress and state legislators to build a new generation of leadership to bridge the divides and strengthen democracy. And then Joe, as I mentioned, is the president of the Democracy Fund. It's a bipartisan foundation working to ensure a strong political system that can withstand new challenges and deliver a strong democracy. He was previously an investment director at a media network where he incubated the Democracy Fund. So they're all amazing experts, and I'm so excited to get started. So we're just going to jump right into it. If you have questions that you want to ask the panelists, please submit them at the Q&A button at the bottom, and we will hope to get to them as we get to the end of our program here. So without further ado, let me start with you, Melody. Let's get grounded. You know, democracy means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. What do you see are the key ingredients for a healthy democracy? And what are some of the greatest challenges facing the US democracy today?
Well, first of all, I am thrilled to be here with you and this panel and the audience, and to have the opportunity to talk about an issue about which I am very, very passionate. After spending many decades in politics and something that I care about, politics and policy, it was a goal of mine to dig deeper and to think about what sits underneath all that, which is our democracy, our constitutional republic, and the issues facing us not only domestically, but globally. And Pam, I think in answer to your question, there are a few things that I think about when I think about a healthy democracy, and I think about a healthy democratic culture. One, I think about citizenship that is inclusive, that is predicated on small L liberal democratic principles of tolerance and pluralism and rule of law. I think about healthy fact-based discourse and a media that allows for that. Also about economic growth and opportunity and social mobility. I also focus on issues like resilient democratic governance around the world. And all of those issues, I think, feed into what I would call a democratic culture. And it's something that the students at UVA talk quite a bit about. And I think when I have conversations with people more broadly, they talk about even if they don't refer to it in that way. And also the way that that plays into having accountable and effective democratic institutions that we can count on. I think part of the problem, this goes to the part of your question about the challenges, is that those issues and our failure to work at each of those issues, to have the kind of democratic culture that sits beneath them and in turn feeds into norms and institutions, it's what's plaguing us right now. I am concerned about those liberal democratic principles, pluralism, tolerance, and rule of law, and our ability to carry those out. I'm also concerned because we refer to ourselves as living in a democracy. We know that technically we live in a constitutional republic, and those Republican ideas that require us as citizens to consent to be governed also mean that we have to be educated in the mechanisms of our government. We have to be able to discern fact from fiction. We have to be willing to engage in the process of reasoning and deliberation. Again, these are Enlightenment principles, and it feels like sometimes we're fighting the Enlightenment all over again. And our inability to do that means that it is difficult for us in a society where we consent to be governed to also hold our elected officials accountable. I think that we are failing miserably at that, and there's a lot of data that backs that up. So I would say failure to have a democratic culture and failure to be able to engage as citizens need to in a democracy.
Good. Thank you for that. Stephen, what would you add to that?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm very honored to be here and very honored to speak alongside Melody and Joe, who are two leaders I've admired for many years. And thank you, Pamela, for hosting this. So I would echo everything that Melody has said, and I would just highlight a couple issues that really prompted me to get involved in democracy work in the first place. And it really started here in Milwaukee, where I'm calling to you from, as a musician. And seeing some of the deep, as a musician, you come into close contact with different cultures and different aspects of a community. And in Milwaukee here, I saw the deep racial and political divide that was really plaguing our ability to solve problems and see each other as human beings. And of course, that's a microcosm of what we're seeing nationally. And so two of the trends that really prompted me to found Millennial Action Project was, one, the worsening partisan polarization, which by some measures is the worst since the Civil War era. But also that's coupled with the increasing disillusionment among society, which actually disproportionately hits young people today, millennials and Generation Z, a majority of whom don't believe that politics are going to solve the problems that we face. And so when those two trends collide, I think we were faced with a major question about the future of our democracy, especially with these younger generations pushing our country to be increasingly diverse. So the main question that I would highlight here is one that James Madison articulated in the Federalist Papers, and that's whether America would be a small, homogenous democracy or a large and diverse democracy. And at that time, the thinking was you had to be small and homogenous for a democracy to work, but he envisioned a place where America would become this large and diverse, and perhaps diverse even beyond his imagination. And so at the end of the day, it comes down to whether our citizens and our leaders and our institutions are capable of reconciling the diversity of America through dialogue and through deliberative processes that ultimately allow the public interest to prevail. And that, to me, is an expression of pluralism. It's also an expression of democracy that I saw in my jazz ensembles growing up here in Milwaukee. It was the collision of different backgrounds and influences through an open mind, through an open process of listening, allowed creative breakthrough ideas to emerge. And I think that's democracy at its best. I often say jazz is a call and response art form, just like our democracy should be a call and response political system.
Great, thank you for that. So Joe, to you, so just again, the question, what are the key ingredients for a healthy democracy, and what are the greatest challenges facing the US today on the democracy front?
Yeah, so I don't feel like I need to add much to Melody's description of what a healthy democracy consists of. We went through a long process at the Democracy Fund articulating what we see as the core elements of a democracy and what our core beliefs are. Folks can go on the Democracy Fund's website that you can see that all written up. I think the essence for me is that democracy is a complex political system, which means that what makes it up is not one thing, right? It's not just about voting. It's not just about civil rights. It's not just about civic education, right? It's about the combination of all of these things together and how they interact. And that also means that there isn't one solution to fixing democracy, right? As we do better on voting, we see challenges with journalism, and so we're constantly having to think about how these different aspects of the system impact one another in a jazz-like way, I suppose. But if you had asked me 5 years ago how I think about the health of our democracy, I would have used words like our democracy, the systems of our democracy are under great stress, and that I was really concerned about the health of our democracy. If you ask me now, I would say that our democracy is failing, right? I think we have, it is undeniable that we have turned a corner. And, evidence of that failure is everywhere you look, right? Our country's inability to respond to a historic pandemic that has killed more than 200,000 people and gutted our economy. The inability of our political system to address long-term existential challenges like climate change. The inability or unwillingness of our political system to address the killing of Black men at the hands of police. We have prominent political leaders in this country who openly question science, the value of diversity, and our free press, and take actions to directly threaten the integrity of free and fair elections. And then at the level of the public, the level of division we are experiencing is deeply dangerous, right? Not only does the American public not trust our leaders and our institutions, but the views of partisans on each side of the divide of the other is that the other is the enemy, right? And that the prospect of the other side gaining power is an existential threat to the republic. We've been doing a bunch of polling over the last year on kind of attitudes towards democracy, and we've started adding questions about attitudes towards political violence. And the findings are just shocking to me in terms of when you ask people, how justified would it be for your party to take violent acts if the other side wins the presidential election? And you start seeing, a bare majority within one party actually saying there's no justification at all. That is frightening. So, look, for me, I launched the Democracy Fund back in 2014 as a bipartisan foundation that was intent on working on the long term through incremental reforms. And that's no longer my point of view. I think our democracy is failing and requires transformational change to revive itself.
Good. So I think we've done a fairly good job of, setting us up for this dialogue by at least describing what we mean by democracy and talking about various challenges facing our democracy today. Let's turn now to the work that each of you is doing to address and get after these issues. Let me start with you, Stephen, to just talk about the work of the Millennial Action Project.
Sure. Well, building off of Joe's last point, the need for transformative change, that's something that we've heard from our core network, which is young legislators, that we focus on building leadership capacity with, focus on building bridges amongst these legislators across all sorts of divides that honestly go beyond even partisan divides. So when we have our annual Future Summit, which is our conference, my favorite part is just hearing the different accents of people from every different part of the country. So that's a key part of our work is this legislator network. Now, the second key thing that we work on are reframing issues from a traditional left versus right paradigm into a future versus past. And we focus on a few strategic issues. To give a couple examples, this year we focused on democracy modernization as well as safe voting, and can share a couple stories from that, as well as racial justice and criminal justice reform through a partnership with a movie called Just Mercy about the real life story of Bryan Stevenson. And what that allows us to do is we've built the relationships, we have these strategic issues, we can bring these legislators together through this network of caucuses that we've formed in both state legislatures as well as in Congress called future caucuses. And that allows them to put this vision of political bridge building into practice, into actual policy reforms. And one of the big wins that we saw just in the past few months related to safe voting is being able to mail out absentee ballots or ballot requests to registered voters in some of the key states that will have a lot of scrutiny this November: Wisconsin, Ohio, Iowa, Michigan, and others. And so that's going to have a huge impact. And a lot of those reforms only happened because we built a coalition across party lines. And then the third key thing is developing a new bridge building methodology that I would argue hasn't really been offered to us by the media narrative. It feels too often that we're forced to choose between a bipartisanship that's about splitting the difference and finding the least common denominator. And for those of us who believe in racial justice, what are you splitting the difference on? And the other approach being just sheer partisanship that denies the anything from the other side. It's like, I'm a big Green Bay Packers fan. So it's like, there's nothing good that the Chicago Bears could do. And there's nothing wrong that the Green Bay Packers could do. But that's the kind of tribalism offered in that type of political philosophy. I would argue neither of those approaches represent the hope of our democracy. And I call our methodology radical bridging, because it is about the need for, as Joe mentioned earlier, transformative change, and through a process of reconciliation and bridge building. And the paradigm that really helped me understand that was thinking about Dr. King's philosophy. We hosted Martin Luther King III, his oldest son, at our last summit, and we really dug into this. What does it mean to be a radical change agent, a transformative leader, as well as a political bridge builder, and really broke down that at its core, it's about empathy and love. It's about empathy for those who are suffering and need help, but it's also empathy for those who are politically and different from us, and different in perhaps other ways as well. And in this diverse democracy, we need that love and empathy for all of, in his words, God's children. So that's the methodology that we're instilling in our leaders, but also trying to promote. So those are the three big things. It's the legislative network through these relationships. It's working on strategic issues by reframing them. And then third, it's cultivating and promoting this new bridge building methodology.
That is wonderful to hear, and so heartening that you're making as much progress as you are on the Hill. So Melody, let's talk now about the work being done at UVA, and talking about the work that you co-founded or co-leading around the Democracy Initiative.
Sure. One thing, I guess we should warn the audience, it seems like between Packers, Bears, Pam's a UVA alum, I work at UVA, I'm a Carolina alum, we could have, our own brawl right here. But I am excited to work at UVA and do this work. I mean, I think starting with the leadership at the institution, there's a strong sense that because of the legacy of this institution, that which is challenged and that which is really exciting in terms of the shaping of democracy and this idea of an educated citizenry and broadening that so that we're talking about everyone as an educated citizen, that it is an interesting and important place to do this work. The ingredients that we were talking about earlier form the framework and the approach that we take, the lens that we use to think about our work on democracy. And with some of the best faculty, some of the best students, graduate students, being in the city of Charlottesville, all of those things provide a robust environment for us to do our work. So we focus on research, we focus on teaching, not only for students at UVA, but beyond the four walls of the university, and engagement in public affairs and public discourse. And in doing that, we believe that it's very, very important that we not only generate ideas. I can remember when I used to work in the Senate, when I worked in the White House, Senator Kennedy would say, I read, Professor so-and-so op-ed, I want to talk to them. So I understand that legislators, that the public, both domestically and globally, are listening to, paying attention to the ideas being generated in a university setting. So we build off of that, an idea generation, but we also think about the importance of disseminating those ideas, that we can't have an elite ivory tower on the hill kind of a conversation, that it's important to put those ideas in the bloodstream. And there are the range of actors that need to be engaged, not just in hearing, but helping to shape them is important, from policymakers, obviously, to business leaders, to philanthropists, to the broader public, to activists, and the list goes on. And then we think about how we engage students in our work. So just to give you an example of some of the things that we're focused on, we've got several big research projects underway focusing on some of the biggest challenges facing democracy domestically and globally. And they also create new coursework, and we're pushing those ideas out. But for example, we have what we're calling laboratories, interdisciplinary laboratories. One of them is focusing on issues of democratic institutions and the challenge of corruption and what that does to those institutions and does to democracy. They now are focused and in partnership with the Anti-Corruption Data Collective and looking at the pandemic relief that we appropriately very quickly pushed out, but thinking about the tremendous sums of money that are now moving across the United States, larger than even when I was in the Obama White House and we worked on the Recovery Act, and collecting that data, analyzing that data, creating a database that will be publicly accessible so the public, journalists, and others can look at that work and understand where those dollars are going and the institutions that are using them in a way to help encourage the transparency that's necessary, the oversight that's necessary in a democratic environment. Another example that I'll give, in 2019, we hosted our first Democracy Biennial. That time was called the Presidential Ideas Festival. We'll do it again in 2021. This is an opportunity to bring across ideological lines journalists, policymakers, domestic and international activists and others together to engage again in these big questions. What we plan to do in the fall of 21 is to move beyond the conversation. I mean, we've all been to a million conferences and we've been talked at and heard a lot, but to also talk about and bring in people who are doing the work on the ground so that we can better understand what's working, what's not, what people can take home, how they can learn from one another so that we can continue to address these issues. And I could go on and happy to talk about it later as opportunity presents itself about some of the other things that we're doing, podcasts, course-related materials that are going along with that, et cetera.
That's terrific. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And then, so Joe, finally, you've been focused, as you mentioned, for at least 5 years, working on kind of how to think about a strong democracy. I've certainly participated in some of your events, trying to educate people with real data and analytics, which is so critical to this. Talk a little bit more about what you're doing at the Democracy Fund and how this all got started.
Sure. So the Democracy Fund was created by Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay. I started working with Pierre back in 2011 to kind of incubate the idea of this organization, and then we kind of launched it in 2014. Since our inception, we have given away more than $200 million through the private foundation and then a 501c4 called Democracy Fund Voice that we've created. And we really think of ourselves as kind of a grant maker, but also an advocate through the C4 and then as a philanthropic advisor, right? A few years ago, we realized that as a philanthropic organization that has a staff of more than 50 people who work on nothing but the future of American democracy, we have a lot of expertise and resources that can be made available to other donors and grant makers to help them figure out their strategy. We have created a series of pooled funds to make it easier for donors to contribute to everything from voting to the future of local journalism to the support of faith-based groups that are working on the kind of health of our social fabric. When I think about our work in general, I divide it into the short term and the long term. And in the short term, I really have three primary priorities right now: free and fair election, preventing abuses of power, and trying to mitigate the possibility of political violence. And on the free and fair election front, historically, where we have been most involved has been the kind of mechanics of an election. Right? How do you actually support the election administrators at local right? We have this tremendously decentralized election system for good and ill, where our election is not run at the federal level. It's run by hundreds and hundreds of local administrators within local jurisdictions. And so a lot of our work historically has been working with these administrators to help disseminate best practices, update their cybersecurity, bring in new systems, those kinds of things. Within this election cycle, we stood up essentially a SWAT team of former election administrators, retired election administrators, the best experts in the field who could be available to administrators around the country who are now, implementing brand new systems under very stressful circumstances and very short timelines, and can be a resource in helping to stand up new systems in the world of a pandemic. We also realized that in an environment in which most poll workers tend to be much on the older side, we were really worried about how polling stations were going to be able to function in this current pandemic environment. And so we kind of joined together with a number of others to stand up a campaign called Power the Polls, which has now recruited thousands and thousands and thousands of poll workers to help make sure that local jurisdictions don't need to close down polling places, and we can try to reduce lines as much as possible. So we're doing a bunch of things along those lines, from modernizing election systems to trying to push back on misinformation. Within the world of abuses of power, we've been deeply, deeply concerned about the executive branch right now and the degree to which there's been a remarkable amount of kind of stepping on democratic norms and democratic institutions. And so that's been kind of supporting litigation, supporting watchdogs, and supporting thought leaders who are really trying to raise awareness about these problems. And then, on the political violence side, I spoke to this a little bit a few minutes ago, but we're living through a terrible pandemic, an economic crisis, remarkable social unrest, and deep distrust in our political institutions. And we're going into an election that is going to be tremendously close. And it only takes a spark for some very scary things to happen. And so we've been doing what we can to support organizations that are trying to support de-escalation, work with law enforcement to be more thoughtful about kind of how they approach these environments, and an array of other activities along those lines. In the long term, we really need to think about the systems that make a democracy healthy. And that means transforming journalism. It means creating a new paradigm for social media that ensures that the social media platforms feel a responsibility to the civic health of our country. And it means adopting structural reforms that unrig this system and ensure that abuses of the past never happen again. And we need to focus on those things while building power for those communities that have been disenfranchised and reweaving our social fabric. And so, we're trying to deploy philanthropic leadership in collaboration with our many peers to try to address these kind of short-term and long-term challenges.
Good. So thank you for that, Joe. I think, we talked a little bit about, from you, Stephen, some experiments and projects that are seeing results and improvements. I don't know if, Melody, you could talk about where you've seen experiments or projects that have resulted in examples of healthy democracies.
Sure. Actually, we'll pick up on something that Joe was just talking about in that regard, and then also another place of experimentation, but in a place where we're seeing it at work, not saying it's solved, but at work. And Joe was talking about power building in communities, transformation in communities. One of the entities that sits under the Democracy Initiative umbrella is called the Equity Center. And the Equity Center is comprised of UVA faculty in partnership, in a joint governance relationship with Charlottesville residents to focus on the redress of inequity in the community, but also to try and also build a base of information and practice that can be shared nationally. So for example, there's the democratization of data and work that the Equity Center has done with local institutions, local leaders, to start to map the K-12 achievement gap issues, to map issues with regard to water and challenges with water and environmental justice issues. Also looking at COVID and the impact of COVID and COVID relief. And in doing that, the Equity Center has also created a frontline worker charter that has been taken up by the Charlottesville City Council that will apply to and give residents in the community and in the region a better sense of how employers are engaging with employees who are on the front line, who we say we value, but particularly in that area, disproportionately African-American, Latino, disproportionately affected by COVID-19. So to help those workers. It's an example of our work and the work of the Equity Center in partnership with the community, which is also critically important to the structure of democratic culture, working to develop not only power, but solutions for the broader community. The other thing that I'll mention that's just, again, it's something in response to what Joe said, and you were talking about the transformation of media and media platforms. One of our large interdisciplinary labs, the Deliberative Media Lab, has as its goal not just diagnosing the problem, and I think many of us are feeling it and living it, but also how can we create and work with other sectors to build a platform that encourages deliberation as opposed to undermine and fractures deliberation. That's a kind of work that can take place at a university with resources, with the creative minds, and an interdisciplinary team to think about this and to draw from data, both domestic and global.
So anything, Joe, thank you, Melody. Anything, Joe, to add to that where you're seeing results?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot. Well, my comments have been quite negative. There are lots of examples of really promising developments across the field, and I can look in various different subfields. Within the election space, there's been a tremendous amount of progress over the last several years in adopting a variety of reforms that are really important, whether that is automatic registration, vote by mail, which obviously has a lot of momentum right now, or the recommendations that came out of the bipartisan Presidential Commission on Election Administration that have been really widely adopted across red, blue, and purple states. I do think that some of the most exciting developments are in the journalism space right now, where, when the journalism space has been so fundamentally disrupted, as Melody was saying, that it creates real threats, but also tremendous opportunities to not try to just reclaim what journalism used to be and kind of what it used to be good at, because it also used to be really bad at a bunch of things, right? It did not earn the trust of a lot of constituencies and a lot of communities in our public. And so there's a real opportunity to reimagine how journalism can work, both in terms of its business model, but in terms of its culture and its practices. And, if I think about examples in Chicago, there's a nonprofit journalism outlet called the City Bureau, which really cares deeply about equity in local journalism. They created a program that recruits, trains, and pays a group of highly engaged and diverse citizens to go out and attend and record and distribute information in the community about public meetings and local government decisions as they are being experienced by the community. It's a tremendously empowering practice that really changes the paradigm within journalism. That program is now being brought to Detroit and Cleveland and elsewhere in the country. I think there's been a lot of experimentation in the journalism space over the last few years. And we now know what works, and now it's a question of scaling those kinds of practices.
That's great to hear. So let me just keep moving along, because I know we have a lot of questions coming in. I want to be able to get to some of them. So let's turn to philanthropy. We have a lot of people who have joined us here today who are thinking about how they might support making it a better society for all from a democratic perspective. What can, maybe going back to you, Stephen, what can private funders do to support the health of our democracy here in the US?
Well, I think the biggest thing for private funders, especially in this moment, is not to be afraid to engage in democracy. And I remember when we were first getting Millennial Action Project off the ground in 2013, there was a relatively, and Joe could speak to this too, a relatively small number of funders who wanted to engage in democracy enhancement and reform work. And since then, the space has changed. And one of the exciting developments that I've seen is in the social entrepreneurship space. I still remember knocking on those doors and there being a sense that politics and democracy is too messy, so we don't want to deal with that, but we are making game-changing investments in education and healthcare and the environment. And so we have to build the case that investing in democracy is a force multiplier for each of those individual issues. And that if you don't invest in democracy, that will be a drag on creating any degree of progress on those efforts. And now you see, I'll highlight one great example is New Profit, which has really been a light in the social entrepreneurship space, in many ways defining what it is today. And a few years ago, they started a new program called Civic Lab that would invest in a few democracy entrepreneurs, and we were part of that cohort. But now they're really scaling that up, and they're increasingly creating a field within social entrepreneurship called democracy entrepreneurship, and applying a lot of the principles around cultivating entrepreneurial leaders and organizations that has worked in other spaces to the challenge of democracy. So I think one revolutionary change over the past 3 or 4 years has been that sort of case about the importance of investing in democracy has been made. We can continue to make that case. And some of the fear and anxiety around investing in the space has either subsided a bit, or just the concern of democracy has exceeded any fear or anxiety that existed, and people are really taking that plunge. And I'm seeing that both among institutional private philanthropists, philanthropies, as well as individual philanthropists who are making phone calls to any number of the donor networks in our space and saying, I'm reading what's in the news. I don't really know much about democracy. I've had a long career in business. What can I do to be part of the solution? And that to me is so promising. I just want us to keep that momentum going, regardless of the result in this election, because we know it's taken us decades to get into this mess, and we need long-term investments to get us out of it.
No question about it. So Melody, how should we be thinking about funding democracy initiatives?
Sure, a couple of things. One, I think about, and I think this picks up on something Stephen was saying, the importance of philanthropists being willing to take some risks and to take chances. Having spent much of my career in government is not the place where lots of risks are taken. I mean, for lots of reasons. You've got public money, you've got oversight, there are the politics of it, the list goes on. Philanthropy is a place where more people can take greater risks. I was, in fact, moderating a panel yesterday with Jeff Canada, the Harlem Children's Zone, and we were talking about the fact that it took a decade to start to see some of the return on some of the work that he was doing, but then the return started to show up. So I think about that one. Two, I think about cross-border work and the challenges that we're facing here in the United States we can see similar themes around the world. It may not rhyme, but repeat, but it's rhyming. So the opportunity to work with partners in different parts of the world is an exciting one. Three, I also think about philanthropy and philanthropists as thought partners. and thought leaders. I know from my work in government, my work in the White House, that the relationship that we could have with philanthropy and the conversations, because philanthropists are often seeing a broad landscape and getting a lot of information. And then fourth, I'll just mention, I have to say, close to home in the work that we're doing at the University of Virginia, there are things like our biennial, for example, with an opportunity to bring in domestic and global leaders, activists, all the way literally to heads of state. And as I was saying, as we focus on 2021, those who are bringing solutions to the table in addition to discussing the problem. I mean, support for the kind of work that kind of work is something that would be enormous for us in terms of not only what we're doing at UVA, but being able to translate and share and spread that around the world.
Great, good. And then Joe, anything people listening in or thinking about funding this initiative should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, how much time you got?
Not much.
You know, look, I'll say briefly, I think there is a tremendous role for philanthropy to play here. And the good news is, over the last few years, we've seen a tremendous increase in terms of the number of new philanthropists coming into the field. And that's just been wonderful. And they've provided not just financial resources, but tremendous energy, which has been great. And, you know, in many ways, my concern has been that their view has been they're kind of in for this presidential cycle, and once we get past this election, they're going to turn their attention elsewhere. And the reality is the problems that we're facing are long-term and structural and systematic, and they're not going to be solved regardless of the election outcome. You know, even the best case scenarios out of this election still can be a bit grim. So, you know, I think philanthropists need to be in this for the long haul. I think, as Stephen was saying, they need to be willing to take risks, right? The greatest asset that we in philanthropy have is the capacity to take risks in a way that other sectors can't, right? We can support innovation, we can allow ourselves to fail and keep on trying things, which I think is a real asset. And I think there's a tremendous, like, relative to other philanthropic sectors, I think the democracy space is highly collaborative. And there's a lot of opportunity, either through pooled funds, through affinity groups, for new funders to come in and work with others in really productive ways. You know, I think in terms of those who are coming onto this call feeling really anxious about this election cycle, there are still ways to get involved and to use dollars in productive ways. Those windows are closing. But, you know, just to throw out an example, there's a nonprofit called Pizza to the Polls, which, you know, they basically, when they see long lines at polling places, they deliver pizzas to those lines, right? And in an environment that we are about to come into, you know, you've seen the long lines that were in Fairfax, Virginia a few days ago. We need to do everything we can to help people engage in their democracy. And right now, I think Pizza to the Polls has a $5 million funding gap, right? And philanthropists can come in right now and help solve that problem. So I think there's a wide array of things that philanthropists can do and support. And, you know, I know the Fidelity team is great about this and helping donors who are trying to chart their path on these issues. Certainly, I'm happy to make my whole staff available to anybody who's trying to chart their course in it. So please reach out.
Thank you so much, Joe. So we only have 10 minutes left, and we've got quite a few questions here, but I'm going to stay with you, Joe, for this first question is, how do corporate leaders, corporate foundations really fit into this conversation? You know, more and more people are trusting their employer to help them think about their own philanthropy, to be socially focused, to stand for something with an enormous amount of pride around purpose. But how do they get pulled in and support democracy without getting labeled as somehow involved in the election cycle or somehow being partisan? I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity there. We and some of our grantees helped stand up an organization called the Civic Alliance, which I think you can get to just civicalliance.com, which is effectively a collaboration between high-profile corporations and public brands who are deeply concerned about the civic health of the country and want to do their part, and have been contributing and supporting things like Power the Polls on the poll worker side. They have supported things like Vote Early Day and Voter Registration Day, which was yesterday, to really put their kind of civic imprimatur onto these kinds of issues. McDonald's, I think, just came out with a big announcement yesterday to help encourage both their employees and their customers to register to vote. And Starbucks has been great along these lines. There are a lot of corporate partners that have played a really important role on the civic engagement side. I would strongly recommend the Civic Alliance as a way to get started.
That's great. So this is a question for Melody. Can you talk about the ways philanthropy supports academic research on democracy, but also the ways in which it helps bring that academic research to government policy work? I think you've talked a little bit about that, but oftentimes what happens in academic settings is there's a lot of great research that's done, but it doesn't get the attention or visibility that is really necessary to drive policy change. What is Virginia doing in this area?
Sure. So the first part of the question was about philanthropy supporting academic research in these issues. And I can tell you that one of the truly exciting things about the work at the University of Virginia is the amount of support that we have received for it, and support, I think, across an ideological spectrum. I mean, people who are truly interested in issues of democracy and the approach that we've taken. So we have support to bring in scholars across a range of disciplines. In fact, we will soon be hiring in an academic market right now that is severely challenged because of the freeze that most institutions have placed on hiring. We're about to start significant academic hiring because of the support of the philanthropists who support the Democracy Initiative across a range of different disciplines. In the past, we have had philanthropists that have specifically come in and said, I believe it's important in the spirit of pluralism and tolerance to fund scholars that are focusing on issues of religion, for example, or philosophy or classics or politics, et cetera. So that's one way that it's been supported. But also through the work of these interdisciplinary labs that I've been talking about, and this goes to the long haul. I mean, we're not talking about investments for a year. We're talking about investments over a significant period of time, recognizing that, as I say, Rome wasn't built in a day. Democracy's challenges didn't evolve in a day. And this is work that really has to go on into perpetuity. So we've received quite a bit of support in that way. And in turn, quite frankly, I think the idea that an academic institution would bring in someone with my background. I am a lawyer by training. I am not a PhD scholar. But to bring me in because of the kind of work that I've done in a policy setting and in a political environment, and respecting and having worked with a range of different kinds of policymakers and understanding how academic research and scholarly work can translate and needs to translate into that environment, and working with scholars. So yes, that article that you've written that has lots and lots of footnotes and has been peer reviewed and is in the political science review document, that's important. In addition to that, how do we build on that so that we can translate that for policymakers who are moving very quickly, and translate that for the public, and bring the public in and others into the conversation, business leaders and philanthropists and others into the conversation, so that the scholarly approach and the approach from those different sectors can come together, and we can develop solutions and help to shape the agenda and shape the debate in a way that helps to move the conversation forward.
That's a great answer, and I kind of think great setting up kind of how reality really works when you're trying to get policy changed. So Stephen, obviously you have done an amazing job kind of building coalitions around millennials and post-millennials. What strategies have you seen or approaches have you seen are most successful for engaging these age groups?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the most important strategy is actually to remain nonpartisan. And what I mean by that is millennials and Generation Z are the least partisan generation in America, and really approaching things focused on issues as opposed to parties. And I actually think that's very promising. So when you see like the Parkland students mobilizing around gun safety and gun violence prevention, it was about the issue. And when people tried to box them into a party or endorse a party, they refused to do that. So that's the key mentality. And I'll share a quick story that also ties to Melody's earlier point about funders being thought partners. One of the funders in our space pointed us to some research that showed that local spokespeople are some of the most effective advocates for educating and encouraging people about voting. And so we partnered with the Ad Council around a series of PSAs that are coming out this week and over the next few weeks, with a number of local spokespeople as well as national series of videos that are about to get a ton of eyeballs on it. And we, working with our local legislators, were able to bring our network to bear, but there were a number of other corporate partners who also brought resources and ideas and creative thinking to bear as well. And all of that is in a nonpartisan type of context, geared at engaging and mobilizing millennials and Generation Z to vote this November. So that's just, I think, inherent in the methodology. And one thing that I notice so often among millennials and Generation Z is that, they resist so much the kind of boxes and the paradigms that the kind of national media is articulating to us. And I think it's just so important to kind of meet millennials and Generation Z where we are, which is very much in a different paradigm. And I can say one of the most frequent questions I get when I speak at college campuses is, hey, I want to get involved in politics, but I don't want to get boxed into one side or the other. I just care about the issue. So just I guess my advice would be try and kind of understand that type of sensibility in the process of engaging young people.
Yeah. That's terrific. So let me just go, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I just want to go to kind of a lightning round here. I think you've given us reason for optimism, Stephen, but I just want to turn to Joe. What causes you to be optimistic about the future of democracy and civic engagement in supporting a strong democratic foundation?
Yeah, look, I don't love the word optimism, right? I don't know that I'm optimistic. I'm determined, right? Like, to me, I think I can talk about young people. I can talk about civic engagement and the amount of energy that we see in the streets and people getting involved and volunteering. I can talk about the fact that our system is actually grappling with questions of race and racial equity in a way that it hasn't in the past, right? Those are all positive things, but I don't think that makes me optimistic. I am determined for us to succeed because I don't see another choice, right? And I feel like we all need to wake up every day with a determination to do our part and to do everything that we can, because the alternative is frightening. And I think that's what we need to hang our hat on, right?
So Melody, just final comment, maybe change optimism to hope.
Yes, picking up on some of the things Joe and Stephen have said, I immediately think about the young adults, the young people, children, that I see engaged now in ways that we haven't seen in quite some time. And I've always resisted the idea of, oh, young people don't care. That has not been my experience. But I think the focus and the attention on issues of democracy, maybe not always using that word, but certainly democratic culture, when I engage people and wanting to hear both sides, wanting to engage, wanting to create change based on the principles of democracy that exist, that's very hopeful to me. And the other thing, and this goes maybe also to the issue of determination that Joe was talking about, and issues of hope, that fundamentally democracy, constitutional republic relies on us.
Yes.
We get to make the choice. Now, the choice that we may make may be a troublesome one, but we do have that ability. We have that power. And in a democracy, with the freedoms that we have, we get to put the ideas into the marketplace of ideas and to debate them and to wrestle with them. And that means that every day we have the opportunity to transform and to live up to the aspirations of our democracy. And to me, that's the reason to keep getting up and to do this work and to be hopeful.
That is such a wonderful way to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Zeev, the Social Innovation Summit. Obviously, really a privilege to honor and work with you on this issue to share all of your insights and perspectives with our audience today. And thank you again, Melody, Stephen, and Joe. Stay safe. Stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Thank you.